those in Cuba. So he was trying to do it both ways, and the first place would be much better for the United States. Now, if the missiles in Turkey were needed to make the arrangement work, the missiles would be removed in Turkey privately and 6 months later to save face with the American people. Because the missiles were obsolete anyway, and they actually were planned on taking them out. But if they took them out now, it would show a weakness to the Soviet Union. So if he had to go to that second option, he was going to tell Dobrynin, we'll move them in 6 months. Not now, in 6 months. And that's the route he tried to take there. If they wouldn't have gone for that, it probably wouldn't have worked at all.
Are these considered tactical nukes?
They're not far from, I mean, they're in Turkey.
They're tactical.
Yeah.
Which means, as opposed to like our Patriot missiles here.
Right.
Now, we also had these types of missiles in Europe at the same time. We had nuclear tipped, offensive infantry type of missiles, like you were talking about the Russians had in Cuba. We had those in Europe also.
Yeah, but Turkey was close. I mean, it's
Yeah,
right
it was
across,
on their doorstep.
right on the doorstep, yeah.
We don't have the
Right.
Iron Curtain and
No.
Eastern Bloc.
No, they were
between.
right on their doorstep, and they'd been there for a long time, yeah.
So did the Soviet Union know that they were obsolete in Turkey and we were going to take them
No,
out? Okay.
no, no. Well,
They should have given them to them right away then.
yeah, well, but see, the military, that was gonna show our Western allies that we were caving into communism. That just wasn't gonna happen at this time in history. Just not gonna happen. Well, during the short drive to the Attorney General's office, Kenneth O'Donnell tried to raise Bobby's spirits by taking a couple shots at him. As Bobby waited at the car door to get in, O'Donnell decided that he would drive instead of the normal driver. And he stood over there because usually they open the door for him. And he went over to the driver's side, O'Donnell, he says, well, did you forget how to open a car door? And then Bobby opened the door to see himself, and O'Donnell chirped at him, you rich people. Anyway, as the two men were driving by the Soviet embassy on the way to the Justice Department, they noticed dark smoke coming out of the building's chimney. And Russian officials were in there burning their documents because they believed that the United States and the Soviet Union were going to war. They knew nothing about this back channel meeting that was about to happen. Well, Bobby was fairly nervous. I mean, he didn't know if he could get her done. I mean, look at the pressure he had on him. If he doesn't get this done, you know, we're airstriking on Monday, invading, and probably going to end up with a war with Soviet Union. So Bobby actually confided in O'Donnell, stating he wasn't sure if he could make this work. And O'Donnell finally responded to Bobby Kennedy by saying, no one else I would trust Helen and the kids' lives with. Kind of gave him a pep talk. He was good at pep talks. Well, the meeting began, and O'Donnell waited outside the office, whistling up some luck for Bobby. That was kind of an Irish thing. Well, you have that handout, I think, in front of you now that says Robert Kennedy versus Ambassador Dobrynin, right? You all have that? I think, I don't know if I have any more. What's that?
And this is very step on our phone.
Oh. Anyway, here's the conversation between Robert Kennedy and Ambassador Dobrynin. You can listen or read it. So Bobby Kennedy goes in there and he says to Dobrynin, my brother, my friends, my countrymen and I cannot and will not permit these missiles to become operational. I promise you that. Dobrynin says back to Bobby, then I fear our two nations will go to war, and I fear where war will lead us. Robert Kennedy then states, if the missiles do not become operational, if you remove the missiles, then there will be no war. At this moment, the President is accepting the terms of Secretary Khrushchev's letter of Friday night. If the Soviet Union halts construction immediately, removes the missiles, and submits to UN inspection, the United States will pledge to never invade Cuba or aid others in that enterprise. So he's trying to get the first part of this done. And Dobrynin says, if your Jupiter missiles in Turkey are removed also, such an accommodation could be reached. And Robert Kennedy's playing poker here. He's trying to hold his cards, and he says, that's not possible. The United States cannot agree to such term under threat. Any belief to the contrary was in error. So he's saying, we're not going to do this because it's under threat. And Dobrynin looks at him and says, you want war? Well, Ambassador Dobrynin showed his disappointment and reached for his briefcase to leave the meeting. Bobby at that point knew he wasn't going to get the first thing accomplished. He was going to have to trade the missiles. So Bobby continues the statement. He says, however, while there can be no quid pro quo, which means this for that, on this issue, the United States can offer a private assurance. Now, our Jupiter missiles in Turkey are obsolete and have been scheduled for withdrawal for some time. This withdrawal should take place within, say, 6 months. Of course, any public disclosure of this assurance would negate the deal and produce the most stringent denials from our government. And Dobrynin replies by saying, this private assurance represents the word of the highest authority, meaning the president, and he said, Robert Kennedy says, yes. And Dobrynin says, and it can be relayed beyond Comrade Khrushchev's ears to the top circles of my government, which means who? Military. And Robert Kennedy says, our pledge can be relayed to any government official Secretary Khrushchev sees fit to satisfy, with the caveat that it is not to be made public in any way, shape, or form. Thank God we didn't have media then like we do now. And we must have an answer tomorrow at the latest. I cannot stress this point enough, because they're going to war, okay? Well, a relieved Ambassador Dobrynin excuses himself to give this valuable information to the Soviet Union, and he turns to Bobby and he says, we have heard stories that some of your military men wish for war. You're a good man. Your brother is a good man. I assure you there are other good men. Let us hope the will of good men is enough to counter the terrible strain of this thing that was put into motion. Well, that night, tension grew for all members of the XCOM committee. Many members went home to spend the night with their families, waiting for word from the Soviets. Kenneth O'Donnell also went to his home that night to spend the night with his family, very concerned, and he was expecting the worst, a nuclear war. That evening, when asked what's going to happen by his wife, Helen O'Donnell, he responded, if the sun comes up tomorrow, it is only because of men of goodwill. That is all that is between us and the devil. Well, on Sunday, October 28th, Premier Khrushchev uses Radio Moscow to announce that the Soviet Union has agreed to remove the missiles and dismantle the missile bases in Cuba. And with that announcement, the Cuban Missile Crisis had ended privately. No other details were given about why. Does that make sense? President Kennedy then met with his staff, and they were all cheering, you know, happy about a great victory over the Soviets, and we really showed them. And this quote is so fitting from President Kennedy. He said, you know, it's been a long 2 weeks, and or whatever, I'd like to thank you all. I think you all did a great job. But I don't think we should be gloating too much. It was just as much a victory for them as it was for us. That's what he told his staff. Well, President Kennedy then excused himself to his office, where he dictated a letter to Rudolph Anderson's mother and father, the pilot that had lost his life in the last spy mission. In his office, Kenneth O'Donnell reflected on the whole thing by picking up a paperweight from his desk, which had the quote, "O God, thy sea is so great, and my boat is so small." I think that's just a great quote. This may have been the way all involved could have summed up the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Couple things I wanted to tell you. The end result of the Cuban Missile Crisis was very important for the United States for 3 reasons. One, in the minds of American citizens, the bold action on the part of President Kennedy made up for the disaster of the Bay of Pigs. The result of the crisis gave the entire country the uplift it needed towards communism, and the result showed citizens that the United States could stand toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union and communism. Now, according to historians, President Kennedy's handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the greatest example of crisis management in the history of the United States. His wisdom and judgment during this crisis is seen as the best in the history of anyone's presidency. On June 10th, I think this is really awesome. On June 10th, 1963, just over 5 months after his on June 10th, 1963, just over 5 months before his tragic assassination, Kennedy gave his famous peace speech at American University in Washington, D.C. Have any of you ever seen that? Hannah has, but she probably doesn't remember. But Kennedy wanted to change American attitudes towards the Soviet Union, and here are some of the most memorable quotes from that speech. He said, "What kind of peace do we seek? I'm talking about a genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes this life on earth worth living. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and by the means the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal." I don't know if you've ever seen that speech, but if you get on YouTube and Google Kennedy's speech at American University, it's a great speech. Well, for the first time and only time, a speech by an American president was covered on a complete page of Pravda, the Soviet main newspaper. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of information that might help you out here. Why did the Soviet Union place missiles in Cuba?
That's my question.
Yeah, well, here it is. Here's the answer.
Okay.
In April of 1962, Premier Khrushchev and one of his generals walked along the beaches of the Black Sea facing the country of Turkey. Khrushchev and the general discussed the American missiles that were located in nearby Turkey. They knew about it. And Khrushchev began to realize the United States was surrounding the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. And this time in history, the United States had approximately 5,000 missiles compared to the 300 that the Russians had in their military. So Premier Khrushchev had studied the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the American intentions in Cuba. I mean, everybody knew what we wanted to do in Cuba. And because of this, Khrushchev wanted to use Cuba with the same intention that the United States was using Turkey, placing nuclear weapons there. So in May of 1962, Cuban and Russian officials met to discuss the probability of putting nuclear missiles in Cuba. And during their multiple-day meeting, Cuban leader Fidel Castro agreed to allow the missiles to be placed in his country. Well, the Soviet operation of placing nuclear missiles in Cuba would have the code name Anadar, named after a Siberian city. Well, in July of 1962, now remember this took place in October, right? 85 Soviet ships left Russia carrying Russian soldiers, 60 nuclear missiles, fighter jets, and military trucks. And once these Russian ships entered Caribbean waters, the United States began flying over the Soviet ships and taking photos. Well, once the photos were developed, American officials recognized the fighter jets and military trucks, but did not see any missiles. Well, once in Cuba, the Russian soldiers would offload the missiles early in the morning while it was dark, and Soviet soldiers wore civilian clothing and were not permitted even to speak Russian while they were in Cuba. Well, on August 29th, a U-2 spy plane shot photographs of Cuba, and these photographs clearly showed surface-to-air missiles being constructed. Not nuclear missiles, but surface-to-air. That was the missile that was used to shoot down Major Rudolph Anderson. They're surface-to-air missiles, and you'll see them on the video. The next U-2 flight was ordered by the military on October 14, 1962, which set the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Premier Khrushchev began to change Soviet world policy, and Khrushchev informed his colleagues that he would be in favor of a treaty to ban the testing of nuclear weapons, something the United States had been pushing for quite a while. So on July 25th of 1963, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain signed a treaty that promised to end all nuclear test explosions in the Earth's atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Well, this agreement became known in the Kennedy administration as the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. Now, I'll tell you a story about these letters. The truth behind these two letters that came is the Soviets accidentally sent them in the wrong order. The first letter should have been the one asking for the missiles to be replaced or to be traded for the ones in Turkey. Okay? And knowing the United States probably wouldn't go for that, Khrushchev then was going to go the second route. So they had them backwards, which really led to a lot of tension. So if they had come in the right order, we would have said no, and they probably would have, you know, said okay, and removed them under the second circumstances, which means we'd have kept our missiles in Turkey anyway. But I mean, the way it worked out, it was just fine. I want to tell you a little bit about Kenneth O'Donnell. I really think he's quite a character, and if you know him, anything about him other than this movie, he was President Kennedy's closest aide, but was better friends with Bobby than he was probably John Kennedy. But he actually was born Patrick Kenneth O'Donnell on March 4th, 1924, and he was a son of Holy Cross football coach and athletic director Cleo O'Donnell. And he served in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Remember, he asked him, you know, you made a living looking down bomb sites. He served in the U.S. Army Air Corps from 1942 to 1945. And after World War II, he studied at Harvard University, and that's where he met Robert and later his brother John. He and Bobby became very close friends as a result of the Harvard years, and even after O'Donnell attended Boston College Law School. Well, O'Donnell worked as a salesman for a paper company in Boston in 1951 and 1951, and in 1952 he helped Bobby in John Kennedy's senatorial campaign. Well, Kenneth O'Donnell legally reversed his names in the early 1960s, and he was the campaign scheduler for Senator John F. Kennedy during his presidential run. In 1961, O'Donnell followed the Kennedys to the White House, serving as President Kennedy's special assistant and appointments secretary. He was perhaps Kennedy's top advisor and part of Kennedy's closest advisors, which they often called the Irish Mafia. Whatever. President Kennedy never officially filled the position of Presidential Chief of Staff, and historians believe that O'Donnell served President Kennedy in that capacity despite not receiving the title. He never did pick a Presidential Chief of Staff. During the Kennedy presidency, O'Donnell was a critic of the Vietnam War and advised President Kennedy to bring an end to America's involvement in the conflict. In November 1963, O'Donnell was involved in the organization of the presidential trip to Dallas, Texas, and on November 22, 1963, during the parade route in Dallas, O'Donnell was seated in the Secret Service car with David Powers immediately behind the presidential limousine. He and Powers witnessed the brutal assassination of the president and their close friend up close. After leaving the Kennedy cabinet, O'Donnell ran unsuccessfully for the Democratic nomination for governor of Massachusetts. In 1968, O'Donnell served as campaign manager for Bobby Kennedy's presidential campaign and went through another assassination of a close friend. After the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, O'Donnell helped the presidential campaign of Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota. In 1976, O'Donnell and David Powers published a book entitled Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, the Memoirs of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and O'Donnell died on September 9th, 1977, of the effects of alcoholism. He got really into alcohol, and a lot of historians believe because of the tragedies that he had faced with his friends. In 1998, his daughter Helen O'Donnell published a book entitled A Common Good, The Friendship of Robert F. Kennedy and Kenneth P. O'Donnell. I have that book signed by Helen O'Donnell, by the way. But anyway, that's a great book if you ever wanted to read it. So there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so what we'll do, if you have any questions, that'd be great. Otherwise, we'll click the video on and show you the rest. Anybody have any questions at all? How about those letters being
And
flip-flopped?
how long later did they find that out?
There was other information later on how many missiles were actually in Cuba and that type of thing, but it was probably 5 years afterwards before they found out that information for sure. But anyway, it came out as good as it could have, because if President Kennedy would have succumbed to the military's request, who knows where we'd be today. So, okay, well, we'll watch the rest of this and enjoy it. This is ringing a bell at all, dear?